You're watching WSTV, Digital Media.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the November 12, 2015 meeting of the City County Planning Board. Would you please join us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Thank you. Today's meeting is being broadcast live by Winston-Salem TV Digital Media. It will be rebroadcast at 10 a.m. Friday morning and again at 4 p.m. Sunday afternoon. Our first order of business today is the consent agenda. These are items for which petitioners requesting withdrawal or continuance, or items for which staff is recommending approval and no one has signed up in opposition. For our public hearings today, each side will have a total of 12 minutes and there is no rebuttal period. Once the public hearing is closed and the board goes into work session, no one's permitted to speak unless a planning board member asks a question. We don't think we will have any public hearings, but I will tell you that the items today, any votes taken today are recommendations that will go to the city council or county commissioners for their approval, or there will be further public hearings on these items. If you are addressing the board today, before you begin your comments, we will need your name, address, and zip code for the record. First order of business is the approval of the minutes September 24 and October 8, 22, and 26 meetings. Any corrections or additions to those meeting minutes?
Move for approval. Second.
Motion, Mr. Mulligan, second, Mr. Lamb. Any discussion? Those in favor? Any opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you. Now call on Aaron King for our consent agenda.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. First item on the consent agenda is item B1. It's zoning docket W3275, and this is a request to rezone 2.3 acres from Ag and RS20 to RS12. And you may remember this from your meeting last month. It was continued 1 month so that a neighborhood meeting could take place. That neighborhood meeting did take place, and afterwards the developer did request withdrawal of his rezoning request. He did so by the deadline for automatic approval, so there's no vote needed on this. This case has been withdrawn. Next item is B2. It's zoning docket W3276, and this is a request to rezone 1.84 acres from residential multifamily 18 units per acre to institutional and public limited use zoning. And you can see the site there in yellow. It's on the west side of Jonestown Road, north of McGregor. Existing structure located on the site appears to have been used as a daycare in the past. This rezoning for IPL is for the three uses: child daycare center, child care drop-in, and residential building single family. Staff recommends approval of this IPL rezoning.
Okay. No one signed up. Is anyone here opposed to this recommendation? So no one, declared the public hearing closed.
Move approval. Second.
Motion, Mr. Lamb, second by Mr. Mulligan. Any discussion?
I just wanted to make sure that, wasn't there a condition about electronic signage on this one?
Prohibited on the site, correct.
And that would be part of the vote?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Any other comments? Have a motion for approval. All in favor? Any opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you.
Next item is B3. It's zoning docket F1557. There's two parts to this request. This is for property located on the north side of High Point Road, west of NC 66. This is near the Vulcan Quarry. So the first portion, tract 1, is the northernmost sliver there that you see. It's currently zoned agricultural, and the request for that piece of property is to go to general industrial special use so that it can become part of the quarry's site. The second portion of this request is tract 2, which is the western piece and the larger piece. It's currently zoned general industrial special use and owned by Vulcan, and the request for this would rezone that to agricultural zoning so that it could be joined in part of the existing church that's zoned AG. There was a site plan submitted for the GIS portion of this. You can see it outlined in red there. The green portion you see is the type 4 buffer that's required by the UDO. It basically shows to have the building that's there removed from the site Doesn't really show any activity on this. It's just essentially to become part of a quarry site as part of a land swap with the church. So staff does recommend approval of F-1557.
No one has signed up. Is anyone here opposed to this recommendation? Seeing none, declare the public hearing closed.
Move approval. Second.
Motion, Mr. Lamb, second by Mr. Mulligan. Any discussion? Those in favor? Any opposed? That is unanimous. Thank you.
Next item is B4, zoning docket W3277, and this is a request to rezone a little over 1 acre from general office special use zoning to limited office special use limited zoning. You can see the site there in yellow. It's on the south side of Vest Mill Road. We had some discussions with the applicant after they submitted, and through those discussions, the applicant determined they could do what they wanted to with the property under the existing zoning. Based on that, they did ask for withdrawal of this rezoning request. They met the automatic deadline, so again, this is automatically withdrawn, no vote needed. Next item is B5, it's zoning docket W3279, and this is a request to rezone a little under 3 acres from RS9 to general business special use, and you can see the site in yellow there. It's on the south side of Renolda Road near Old Town Drive. The petitioner for this case did ask for a 1-month continuance to the December meeting. In this case, they met the automatic deadline for continuance, so we'll see this one in December. No votes needed on this one. Next item is B6, zoning docket W3280, and this is a request to rezone a little over 1 acre from MRBS, which if you remember is our major retail and business district, back to RS9. You can see the site there in yellow. It's on the west side of Peters Creek Parkway, north of the Lowe's development. And this was a little sliver of land that was included with the original Lowe's MRBS rezoning. Not needed to satisfy any UDO requirements, and the developer wishes to rezone this back to RS9. The staff is supportive of this request.
Anyone here opposed to this recommendation? Seeing none, declare the public hearing closed.
Move approval. Second.
Motion, Mr. Lamb, second by Mr. Mulligan. Any discussion? Those in favor? Any opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you.
And the last item is C1. This is a planning board review, and the number is W3278, and this is for a special use permit for the use of kennel indoor. And this is for the rough housing doggy daycare located on Witt Street. You can see it there in yellow. This is kind of south of Stratford Road, north of Queen Street, between Oakwood and Oldwood Street. And this is the site plan that's been submitted with this request. And what you see highlighted or outlined in red is the existing building that's there. What you see shaded in red is what is already approved. These folks came to City Council several years ago to get approval for the existing indoor kennel operation. And what they got approval for was the outdoor enclosure, which is just off the screen to the right if you follow the mouse. And at the same time, they got a reduction in setbacks. Our kennel indoor requirements basically say you have to be 20 feet from a property line. Well, this black line that you see running through the middle of the building is a property line. So when City Council approved their previous request, they waived the 20-foot setback. And that's essentially what they're here for today. Now they wish to expand into the remainder of this building on the left side of that property line. So essentially what this request is for a waiver, special use permit for reduction in setbacks. They're asking to reduce that down to 0 so they can have the kennel indoor operation essentially in that entire building. One thing to note on this, there's no expansion of outdoor play area. What they've got now is what they're going to work with. Essentially, this just allows them to have the dogs in the remainder of the building. This is a little bit different, from what we've done special use permits in the past. What you're seeing today is a planning board review. This will go on to the City Council for a public hearing as a special use permit. And we do need to revise one condition on this under other requirements. This is similar to what's in your report. We just needed to tweak the language to state kennel staff shall be present in the outdoor enclosure and shall have chronic barking dogs removed from the outdoor area. It's similar to what's in your report. We just needed to tweak that language a little bit. So with that, staff does recommend approval of this planning board review item.
Move approval.
Second.
Motion, Mr. Lamb, second, Mr. Mulligan. Yes, sure. Yeah.
Now, I'm very aware of when this original zoning went through on this, and we went and took a look at the site. Did the owners abide by the requirements of that first zoning and the aspects of that were written into that?
I think the only issue that we noted was maybe there was a condition on there that the dumpster be screened, wooden opaque screening, and I believe when you visited the site, you may have seen that it wasn't screened. As far as I know, that's the only issue.
Well, there was a line of trees to be planted. Were those planted?
The buffer yard, there should be a 15-foot type 4 buffer yard in place, and that should be there. I can let the developer
Did the
come up.
owner address those two things that were required by the planning board prior to that?
Well, they had to do this before they got their certificate. Why the dumpster was screened, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So they did it to receive their initial certificate of occupancy 2 years ago.
Apparently.
Yeah.
They do have noted on the site plan that dumpster will be screened. The other dumpster in the middle of the parking lot will be removed.
Well, and was there a requirement on the one last time about some trees being planted? Were they planted, do you know?
Well, they've got to have a 30-foot type 4 buffer yard directly behind the outdoor enclosure and a 15-foot type 4 buffer yard behind the building. So assuming that inspection staff has been out there and made sure that planting requirement is met, there is some degree of existing vegetation that could be credited towards that. I have not been back there, but I assume the inspection staff inspected that and felt comfortable that they've got their plantings in place.
Can the owner address the dumpster and the trees?
Yes, we are definitely,
Yeah, excuse me, we'll need your name and address.
my name is Kim Vaughn, and I'm at 3772 Burbank Lane, Winston-Salem. Yes, I think the dumpster has actually been relocated slightly. I think it was a little bit easier for the truck. It was on a little bit of an unlevel surface, so they moved it, but we have a better location for it now. It is going to be screened in the new site plan, and that is correct. Behind the kennel area, the outdoor enclosure, there is a large amount of vegetation back there. So I don't recall if we planted additional trees at the time, but I know that there is a very deep buffer yard with a lot of vegetation between our outdoor enclosure and then if that's the area that we're discussing behind the outdoor.
Yes, I think I saw some notice. Can you read the plan there, Mr. Robertson, and mention what those trees were? The original one?
Well, I can tell you what the planting requirements are for type 4 buffer yard, 15 foot. It's 2 deciduous trees, 18 primary evergreen plants, which are 6 foot in installation, and 20 evergreen shrubs for a 15-foot type 4. But directly behind the enclosure area where their lot widens out some, the planting requirements are 2 deciduous trees, 18 primary evergreen plants, and 10 evergreen shrubs for 30 foot, a wider type 4 buffer yard.
Okay. Well, could I ask a procedural thing,
Yeah.
Paul? Is that something your inspectors can check on to be sure that all
I was just going to
squared
say,
away?
we can ask our inspection staff, our field inspection
Yeah.
staff, to confirm that it is there as
Yeah.
per the requirements of the site plan.
Yeah. 'Cause in general, I'm very much in favor of this. I mean, I think they do a great job over there. It's just I didn't want us to be lax about things that have been required before and let that slip, and then go ahead and provide another variance.
Well, and they may well have complied, but we'll ask them to double check and confirm that it has been met.
Great. Thank you very much.
Any other questions, comments? We have a motion for approval. Those in favor? Any opposed? That's unanimous. Thank you. Okay. All right, I guess we're ready for staff report, Mr. Morby.
Okay. First of all, I would assume that in your packet, when you got the agenda, you saw the latest development dashboard report, so I just wanted to call your attention to that. Non-residential development continues to be very strong. Residential development, not so much. It's certainly not in the low end, but it's not in the high end either. And you can see from the inset map that downtown activity continues to be strong. And looking at the map of the whole county, you see you've got a lot of development spread all over, and a particular concentration in the central city, west side, south sides there. So just wanted to call that to your attention. We have sign check that is coming up on November 23rd. That is the Monday of Thanksgiving week. So I wanted to get a preliminary idea how many of you might be along with us for that. So if you would let us know what your plans are so we can arrange for what kind of vehicle we need. We had a deadline day for our December caseload this past Monday. We have 3 new rezoning cases plus 1 carryover from today, so that'll be 4 cases. One of them is the Holly Avenue rezoning. So we've already started putting up signs in that area, started getting some calls there. And then there's another case out in Tobaccoville. So sign check will probably be not a short one, but it won't be a real long one either. But we'll have to go around and see all those signs in Holly Avenue because we posted quite a few, and then we'll have to get out to Tobaccoville as well. We have 1 planning board review that would be a elected body special use permit as well. Area plans, kind of status of that. The Southeast Suburban Plan, we have our meeting number 3, community meeting number 3 coming up November 17th, and then our final drop-in meeting on December 8th. The Southwest Area Plan kickoff will be the 19th of November, so that'll be next week, next Thursday. And the Rural Hall area plan update. The kickoff will be sometime in January. We haven't set the date yet, but we're going to need a planning board member to volunteer to be the liaison on that one. So you might. I see a volunteer right there. Okay. And then finally, we have a historic marker unveiling in Reynoldstown, and that is this Sunday at 3 p.m. So if anyone's interested in location information, we can get that to you. So last piece, these were informational pieces. Last piece, we want to, as we talked about at the last work session, we wanted to talk a little bit more, give you a chance to talk a little bit more about the accessory dwelling text amendment. And so what I'll do as Kirk comes up there is we answered a number of your questions from the last work session. George Bryan emailed in several other questions, so we answered those in a handout that we got you. George also emailed in some questions last night, so we'll be able to verbally talk about that. But let me, before Kirk talks, let me just kind of give you the kind of the bare bones essence of what it is we're trying to do. You know, first of all, we're trying to retain the possibility of accessory dwellings, which the UDO has allowed for many decades. So we think that is an important thing to provide. Most other cities that I know of have provisions for accessory dwellings, so we're trying to retain that possibility. But we're also trying to respond to the legal constraints from recent case law that affects our ability to qualify that or set criteria based on the occupants. So we have to adjust to that in a way that still allows accessory dwellings. And so what we felt the best thing to do is to propose an expansion of the physical criteria that a property has to meet to qualify to even ask for a accessory dwelling. So we've expanded the restrictions on that, and those are designed to try to help them be truly subordinate to the main dwelling unit and to have less visual impact. So that was our goal as we were doing this. That's certainly what we came up with is our recommendation. It can certainly be tweaked, and if the planning board would like to suggest today any proposals for changing those criteria, that's fine. But what I would suggest is that if you all feel comfortable at least with having a public hearing, that we have the public hearing in December, and then if you get some input from the public input that would cause you to want to tweak it some more, you could do that. So it just having a public hearing doesn't certainly lock you into adopting that or only that or recommending that or only that. So anyway, your choice as to whether you want to do any tweaks now and or later on. But with that, I'll turn it over to Kirk. He's not going to go over all that list that you got several days ago, but he'll highlight some of the more recent questions.
All right. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Before we talk about the more recent questions, I do want to see if there's any clarifications or anything we need to do for you with regard to the questions that were sent out with your packet. I'll be glad to answer any follow-up questions on any of those things before we move into Mr. Bryan's questions.
Mr. Bryan continues to have questions that continue to perk up from every single place I go and sit down. In other words, I'm getting a lot of feedback on this. When we talk about the definition of the family that you answered in that, and so we're talking about two structures on a piece of property with 4 unrelated people in each one, not 4 unrelated people across the structures, correct?
Correct.
Now, the thing that we're into, and I'm part of this. I mean, I rent a house through VRBO. We also have day rentals of houses like this. So if you've got an accessory building there in a neighborhood like the West End, I'm assuming that it's legal for that person to rent that on a daily basis, on a per day basis,
The way
in that same neighborhood.
The way that the city attorney's office views VRBO, Airbnb, and things of that nature, and board members, just for your information, this is question number 2 on the sheet that I put at your desk. But the way that the city attorney's office views this is such arrangements are considered a lease. And it would be no different from a legal perspective than a standard year-long, 6-month lease on a piece of property. This is just a shorter lease. It's still basically a contractual arrangement between whoever's leasing the property and whoever's occupying it. That being said, we don't regulate leases on private property.
Right.
Now, if someone through VRBO was offering more of a bed and breakfast type experience where there's meals prepared or other accoutrements besides just the occupancy of the structure, then we would have to treat that as if it was a bed and breakfast. And in that case, it would have to go through the proper permitting channels with the city. But if it's just a standard, either accessory unit or principal residence without even an accessory unit listed on VRBO, the city currently isn't getting into any of that. Now, one other piece of information.
Let me add that the proper permitting procedure that Kirk was referring to is a use permit for a bed and breakfast if it's in a single-family residential district.
One other piece of information that I want to put out there for you is you may recall one of staff's work program items that we're going to be doing later in 2016 in the spring of this year is doing a report on new uses like zip cars and Airbnbs and some of these things that have just emerged as a result of recent technology and recent trends that there's not a lot of legislation enacted about them currently. So after we see what other cities are doing, that may or may not make us take a different tack in how we permit such uses, but our current position is that it's just a type of lease.
So it is allowed.
Correct.
And I'm familiar with the bed and breakfast because that has been an issue we've dealt with our neighborhood, and I've seen it dealt with other neighborhoods. The gray area is confusing in between these things because if I leave out bagels and cream cheese in my VRBO, is that considered a bed and breakfast?
My understanding, and I'll let Desmond chime in if necessary, but my understanding is it's the actual person being present doing the serving that constitutes the shift from just a lease type situation, a rental type situation, to an actual bed and breakfast.
And so what we're proposing here potentially is that it would be looser on this other, or that it's currently a looser standard on that, and we may have more of these opportunities if they're accessory buildings. But in the bed and breakfast, what we had was an on-site manager that was maintaining some kind of in and out responsibility to neighbors, other things like that. In this, the way I'm reading it, I could rent out my house and my accessory dwelling to somebody without residing on that property or without any oversight on a day-by-day basis.
That is correct.
But both a bed and breakfast and a detached accessory dwelling both of them would still require a special use permit from the Board of Adjustment. So in both of those cases, they still have to go through a public process to do it.
I need to hear more about that. Yeah.
I mean, that's what we've been talking.
Well,
okay. What I was just saying a few minutes ago is a bed and breakfast in a single-family residential district has to have a special use permit from the Board of Adjustment.
Right.
A detached accessory dwelling under both the current
a detached, yes, a detached. But if it's attached,
if it's attached, it does not. Right.
And attached, according to what you have provided us with, is a very creative relationship. Standing near, I'm attached to Mr. Hicks here, and there are some other definitions of that which make that fairly easy to call an accessory building. Is a sidewalk enough to call it attached?
Basically, the way that something would be determined to be attached would either be within a wall being within 3 feet of the exterior wall of the principal structure, regardless of if there was a sidewalk or anything else like that in between it. Let's say you had a 5-foot sidewalk and a building on either side of it, that would not be considered attached because it exceeds the 3-foot distance. The other way that attachment could be described in the ordinance is if you have a roof connecting completely between one structure and another structure. Now, one thing that we did highlight in our responses is if that's a stumbling block for you all, we could write a special definition of attached for the purposes of this section of the ordinance. But I will just mention to you that the limits in terms of size and things are more stringent on attached units than they are on detached. You can only have it be 30% of the square footage of an attached structure. So that may be more limiting. And also, generally, someone who wants to rent one of these things out or something of that nature, they probably would rather have it be a separate structure that's actually separated from their property or their principal residence to give them some more separation between them and the tenant. In other words, if I'm building one of these next to my house and I have a piece of land, I'm probably going to put it closer to the rear of the property and have some space between the principal structure and the accessory structure.
And, I'm sorry, let me just ask one more question. And right now, the way this is structured, this is for Winston-Salem city limits. Is that right?
And Forsyth County.
And Forsyth County?
Yeah.
So it will go to the commissioners.
Eventually, we'll take it to the city council first.
Okay, yeah. It won't affect Clemens. It won't affect Kernersville.
Well, we let all those independent jurisdictions know about the text amendment, and it's up to them as to whether they want to take it up or not.
Accept it. What other jurisdictions would it not affect?
Well, it would be Kernersville, Clemens,
Walkertown?
And Walkertown and Louisville.
And Louisville. Okay.
Right. They all have independent zoning authority.
And the county, of course, does zoning for Tobaccoville and Rural Hall and Bethania.
Right.
So
Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just had another follow-up question, unrelated to what George just asked, but in the questions and the answers we got about the minimum amount of square footage per person, that was the first set of answers that we got back. I'm reading this to mean that if you have 1,000 square foot accessory dwelling,
you could potentially have 8 people, and additional young children. Is that correct?
It would be 7 people, I believe, because it's, the first person is 120 square feet, and then 100 for each individual person. So if you had 8,200, then you could have 8 people. 8,000 would just be 7 people.
So
I'm sorry, 800, that's what I meant to say.
well, I'm saying
She
if
said
1,000 square
1,000
feet, you could get 8 people. Is that
Okay,
correct?
yes, correct.
Okay.
Of course, if you had a 1,000 square foot detached accessory dwelling, that would mean you would have had to have a lot of.
Need about a half an acre
half an
lot.
acre.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, assuming you have a half an acre lot and 1,000 square foot building, you can hold 8 people plus additional young children. Correct.
Correct.
Yeah, I think that's a lot. And that's one of the things that's a big concern for me.
One thing, and this may be an appropriate place to point this out, is just looking at this ordinance a little bit further after the work session. We actually went on GeoData and looked at some standard lot sizes in different neighborhoods in GMA2, the older part of the city, and kind of played around with that to see what you would get under this ordinance, recognizing that 1,000 square feet is the cap that we put on these accessory detached units in any case. We looked at, for example, the Ardmore neighborhood. Most lots are between 8 and 11,000 square feet. If you're doing a standard RS9 density lot, that would only allow you to do a 450 square foot unit. In order to do the full 1,000 square foot structure, you'd need a 20,000 square foot, basically half acre lot, which, given the standard urban and older suburban neighborhoods, those aren't as common as you might think in those areas. So some of this will be more limiting than what it would look like just from the fact sheet that we provided. Most of the older neighborhoods, at least in the inside Silas Creek Parkway, you're probably looking at lots ranging from 7,000 to 15,000 square feet in size. Basically, up to about a third of an acre is usually the lot size you'd see. And in those cases, your units would range from 350 to 750 square feet. So if there's not any further follow-up questions on the information that we sent out, I'd like to go ahead and just talk more about the questions that George asked us and our responses to those. So the first question that Mr. Bryan asked is for some more information on the Washington Park neighborhood case that went before the Board of Adjustment and to the court. And to talk about that, I have Jerry Contos from the attorney's office here, and he's going to give you some information on that.
Good afternoon. I guess I'll just open it up to any questions. I'm not certain exactly what the questions are. Depending on how deep we get, we may need to go into closed session.
Mr. Condos, I apologize that I have not read all 65 pages of what was sent over, and so it will take me a bit of time to do that. But when it comes to cases like this, obviously, or what maybe it isn't obvious, but one of the feedbacks I've gotten has been from that Washington Park neighborhood where this came up, and concerns about accessory dwellings. And it seems to me that as a neighborhood that the neighbors should have some standing, in a sense, on an issue like this. So how does the ZBA look at neighbors if these cases come up in front of it for a detached accessory dwelling? Does the neighborhood have any standing, or is it just the immediate neighbors to the property that is being dealt with?
I'll try to address it as best I can. There's not well, I guess there is a cookie cutter formula. The general statutes require standing, and standing is defined in of the general statutes. One is deemed to have standing if they are an aggrieved party. To carry that a step further, the courts have said that an aggrieved party is one that is able to show some sort of damage resulting from a particular decision. So generally speaking, those that wish to engage in the process, in this instance, the appeal to Superior Court, individuals wanting to participate in that process must be able to show some damage. Typically, that damage is a resulting loss in property value. So it would be incumbent upon an appellant to prove that standing.
And I guess this is one of the things that's concerning me about the proposed language in the UDO. If it all goes to the ZBA and there is no perceived grievance or standing for people living down the street and others like that, then it becomes a fairly quick action, I think, by the ZBA and could change the nature of the neighborhood fairly quickly, piece by piece, rather than in a sense of looking at the whole other thing. Let me ask it from a different direction. If I was the member of a homeowners association that had a covenant that said I could only have one, I don't know what's legal, one family, is that normal in a homeowner association?
Perhaps, but let's go under that.
Okay, and said that, then this isn't going to affect the homeowners association.
Well, you're talking about really two different things. The covenant of the association is a matter between private parties, the homeowners. Mm-hmm. So in that instance, it would be incumbent upon those private property owners to bring their own action to enforce that private covenant.
Okay.
In other words, the city recognizes its own ordinances. So if, in this instance, an accessory dwelling is allowed pursuant to an issued special use permit, the city could grant it, for example. Now, if the covenant said something different, again, the city's only looking at its own ordinances. It would be incumbent upon the private property owners or the association collectively to go into court to enforce their own covenants. In other words, the city wouldn't step into a private legal matter and try to argue on behalf of one side or the other.
The city wouldn't have any police power over private covenants.
Or I'll give you kind of an analogy. Yeah. You know, many covenants don't allow certain types of fences, wooden fences. Well, mm-hmm. If you're going to come down to the inspections department and get a permit to build a fence, assuming you meet all of the requirements, you will be granted a permit. Now, your homeowner association may restrict the building of fences, but again, that's a private matter, a private contract, those covenants for those private parties to enforce.
This may seem convoluted, but so a neighbor could opt out of this by charging everybody or becoming a homeowners association and having a small fee and simply having that agreement among the homeowners that they shouldn't have an accessory building?
I'm not sure I'm following you. If the question is if there is a new subdivision and they put that in their restrictive covenants, their bylaws, then certainly when you purchase your lot in that subdivision, you become a party to that contract and agreed. I will not.
Or I suppose, Jerry, that if it was an existing subdivision and they all, 100% of the property owners agreed to record restrictive covenants on their own property, they could do that after the subdivision is built too.
Yeah, so because I'm trying to look at sort of a fairness that's going across here, because what I'm seeing and hearing from neighborhoods is that, yeah, if you live off Country Club and you're not in a HOA, if you live off Reynolds Park and you're not in an HOA, if you live off of, if you live in Sherwood Forest, if you live in Town and Country, in Town and Country is one that you would think was an HOA, but it isn't. And that you're applicable to this. If you live in Greenbrier, you're not. If you live in other neighborhoods like that, you're not being affected by this along the way. And I'm trying to, and it's helpful, your explanation on that, but it still is, it still means that this won't be applied evenly across neighborhoods because of neighborhoods' choices on this, and wondering where we could go with a similar type of thinking with a UDO that would give neighborhoods choices, just as HOAs have made us.
Well, it's just like any zoning regulation that applies across the board to similar properties, but if a neighborhood chooses to have restrictive covenants that are more restrictive, then that exists right now. That possibility exists right now. The other possibility is if a neighborhood felt very strongly that the character of the neighborhood is founded on individual homes with no accessory dwellings, they could go through the process of petitioning to become a neighborhood conservation overlay district, just like a couple of our neighborhoods have done there. Now, the two neighborhoods that have done that don't have that restrictive feature that says no accessory dwellings, but that doesn't mean that a neighborhood in the future couldn't propose to do that. They would have to have substantial majority support for that to go through the process, but it wouldn't require 100%.
Which would be easier than getting new restrictions agreed to by 100% of the owners if you want to buy.
I guess Ms. Donna couldn't apply to that because it wasn't an easy process in Mallard Lake.
No, it's not easy, but certainly you couldn't get 100% for anything anywhere.
Right. But your expectation in Mallard Lakes with the MCO, just like the other one, was that there would be one residence in that area. It just didn't take into account accessories, right?
Right, because there was no reason to at that time, but now there is.
So it sort of forced those folks that had done that to go back to the table?
We would have to go back to the table, which would be very, very difficult. And it does, in a sense, undermine what we were trying to do.
If I could, one aspect that you brought up in your earlier question about standing for neighborhood organizations or whatever, this, albeit with those provisos in terms of what constitutes standing, there wouldn't be anything to prevent a neighborhood organization from getting with the property owners that are immediately adjacent or could be impacted and advising them in terms of how they might approach making their concerns known to the Board of Adjustment. So that certainly is open. It just would restrict the organization's ability to be a party of standing.
And let me piggyback on what Mr. Norby said in case I may have led you astray. An association could participate in such a proceeding if at least one member of the association is able to prove standing. Okay. So it wouldn't preclude an association from participating. It's just that at least one member of the association must be an agreed party, must have standing.
I have a question, and it's a kind of a complicated question, so I'll try to be as clear as possible. One of my concerns, and I've raised it before, has to do with the number of occupants that would be allowed with the 2 families per lot. And what I think would be a better result would be to restrict it to a single family. And I'm not saying relatives, I'm saying what we have in our UDO as the definition of family, which does allow non-related people to be included in that definition. Our definition of family is very convoluted because several years ago we wanted to prevent rooming houses, and I think we also wanted to prevent attached accessory dwellings because the language pretty much forbids that. And so we have a definition that makes it difficult to say one family per lot. What I'm asking is, could we change that definition to remove the language having to do with single housekeeping unit and no locks on the doors and no separate entrances and things like that? If we removed all that language so that we simply said that there can be an unlimited number of related people plus 4 additional unrelated people, and that definition was to range over both the principal and the accessory dwelling, would it be possible to do that?
You are correct. That is a very complicated question. We'll definitely have to take a look at it a little further. Initially, there are some concerns. Ultimately, it would be a combination of a legal decision, but also a policy decision, because by changing that definition, there may be some unintended consequences with the boarding and rooming houses.
Exactly.
So
I
we'll need to
recognize
take
that.
we'll need to take a closer look at that to see if there is a way to make it work. So we will certainly look at that and get back.
I have a question. How would this, in areas we have larger lots, or say out in the county, could you, if they had enough property, they could essentially just make a separate lot, and then this would go away, because each dwelling would be in its own place. So is there anything that would limit, if you had a large enough lot, you could do that?
If you had a large enough lot, you could certainly just follow the standard major or minor subdivision procedures in the UDO currently. And that happens all the time. People come into the zoning counter and they get their minor subdivision. They take their prescribed number of cuts off a major street and don't even have to bring it before the board for the preliminary subdivision review like you'd see for some of the major subdivisions that come in.
So it wouldn't interfere with someone's ability to do that?
Correct.
Okay. Because I know like out in the county, you're going to have larger lots, and maybe, I don't know, if I wanted to finish the attic in my barn and have somebody live there, I'd have to get a special use permit, I guess, if the way it's written went through.
Well, and one thing I'll caveat my earlier response is, let's say you had what might have been considered an accessory unit, and then you have a principal structure, and you wanted to cut the accessory unit off. You would still have to meet the prescribed setbacks for a principal structure to do that. So you'd have to make sure that your lot was still conforming with regard to dimensional, area, and setbacks.
And even in the county now, you would have to get a special use permit for that detached accessory dwelling.
Could I ask another question? Would it be possible here to have a requirement that the home has to be a certain number of years old, say 5 years, before you can do an accessory dwelling? The reason I'm asking is I think that allowing accessory dwellings in new construction kind of goes against really the justification for them in the first place. If we want to recycle our existing housing stock, we might as well kind of limit it to houses that are already existing. And would something like a 5-year age requirement work here in North Carolina?
My initial reaction is that gives me some pause, but I'll take a closer look at it and see if there's any authority to.
If I could throw out some policy concerns here, at least from the staff level, I would be concerned about that too. If you look at the literature on new urbanism and smart growth that has been around for the last 10, 15 years, and you look at a number of the kind of celebrated smart growth communities that have been built, even in North Carolina, one of the features of them is allowing for accessory dwellings. They call them granny flats. And so if you go, many years ago, the planning board and staff took a tour to North Mecklenburg County, saw some of those new urbanism projects there, and actually saw some alleyway accessory dwellings that were part of that. And the folks that promote new urbanism and smart growth say that's really a good thing to do. It doesn't affect the look and feel of the neighborhood, but it gives some affordable housing options for someone to live in an area that they otherwise couldn't afford to.
But following up on that, is there a way then to approach it that the staff could come up with a UDO that in new construction that's allowed? And I guess my thinking around that is that people buy their homes in particular neighborhoods because they don't want other folks around, or they want large lots so they have elbow room, or they want to keep animals or whatever. And so when we go about changing the UDO into what I essentially see as saying you're allowed to have a duplex on every lot, it changes the ground rules for the neighbors that had invested and decided that that's where they wanted to live. Whereas I have no problem whatsoever with us having developments that have that as part of it, because people are moving into it with the expectation that that's the way it is, and it's good, and they're not surprised about it. They're comfortable with it, and they make choices, and they may want to generate rent off of that or whatever they want to do off of that. So I really like that idea of density, and it could even be carved down to something that would be a fairly small subdivision or whatever in the midst of that, so that people would know right off that that's the style.
Right. Well, and there's a way to do that now.
Doesn't exist already, right?
What's that?
We're not creating anything here that does not exist already, the ability to do.
Exactly. But the way to do that with a brand new subdivision would be for someone to come in with special use district zoning. Mm-hmm. And as long as that is said up front as part of the special use district zoning, then you don't have to get a Board of Adjustment special use permit for each individual lot there. It's covered through that special use district zoning.
So we don't need the UDO in that case.
They could do it in that case, and then what this covers is essentially what our ordinance for several decades has allowed, is individual detached accessory dwellings by special use permit only.
Right.
The only difference is it was allowed only if you had certain categories of relationships there, whereas this, you still have to get the special use permit, and we're replacing that with more restrictive physical nature. So I would take a little exception to the description of it's a duplex, because with these rules, this is clearly trying to say that accessory dwelling is subordinate both in size, location, how it functions on the property, how the parking works and all that. So it's trying to make it subordinate. Now, we can certainly tweak it some more to emphasize that even more than what we did there, and that's certainly something you could either do now or wait till after your public hearing to do.
Yeah, I think we need some options when we're looking at this along the way. I'm still not, I guess, comfortable with the answer on parking along that, because unless there's some requirement that the house that's there already have a certain number of off-street, and then we're redefining families, and so that means we could have more cars. Stacking doesn't seem to be realistic, so I think we need an alternative that gets around that there needs to be a separate place. If we're going to have potential of 4 people living in that, then I see one spot as being inadequate, and something that we wouldn't do in other places. We would have higher requirements for that for an apartment building that, where we're expecting maybe a car and a half per apartment or something like that. Isn't that the general requirement with most apartment buildings?
Depends on the number of bedrooms.
Yeah, and so I think we need some alternatives like that really deal up front with those issues that I'm hearing from neighborhoods are going to affect the way their street is, the way their other people are around, and that's assuming that neighborhoods would want to deal with this at all in terms of being a general UDO.
one thing, again, just to clarify for the board, is that this ordinance would require the applicant to demonstrate how parking would be provided for that accessory unit. So that may be different depending on where the unit is proposed. Let's say you have a situation where you're in a more urban type of neighborhood where you don't have any room in the existing driveway or on the street. You may need to add another parking space somewhere on the property to provide that. But let's say you're in a more suburban context where you have a long driveway with kind of a pull-off parking pad to the side. You may be able to demonstrate that you meet the UDO parking requirements for that principal residence and still have a space already on your lot to provide required parking for that detached accessory unit. So the goal with this ordinance is to provide some flexibility in parking with the premise of reducing the impact visually and aesthetically on the neighborhood. So rather than automatically requiring a certain amount of parking for an accessory unit, the principal use may already be adequately served by parking, and we're trying to provide some flexibility and not just adding parking unnecessarily if there's already adequate parking on the site.
Well, I'm a little confused about that. How would you state that in the ordinance?
Let me see if I can find the language. Okay, I'll read what the draft ordinance says. Parking for the detached accessory dwelling shall be served by the same driveway as the principal dwelling. One parking space shall be provided. It shall be demonstrated how parking will be provided through the site plan submitted for the special use permit process. So that's basically saying, like in my example, if you already have, say, a large parking area plus 2 spots in your garage in a suburban type context, you may demonstrate on your site plan, I already can accommodate this extra car and still meet the parking ordinance for my principal residence and this accessory residence. But if I'm in an urban neighborhood and I only have a driveway with 2 cars back to back right now, I'm going to have to provide another space somewhere on that property meeting these ordinance requirements to accommodate that extra person.
Okay, so you're still assuming then only 1 space per ADU regardless of the size of the ADU, is that
correct? And those requirements would be very much in line with the requirements for an apartment of that kind of size.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could key it to the number of bedrooms, because that would be more likely to reflect the number of cars that the unit might need to have. If you had, say, 2 bedrooms, maybe 2 spaces.
That's certainly something that could be considered. I will say that may or may not address your principal question, though, about if 4 people live in one of these accessory units. You could conceivably have that happen even if it was a 1-bedroom unit. So there may not necessarily be a direct link between number of cars and number of bedrooms.
Right, but I think that'd be a little more realistic. I mean, especially when you could have as many as 8 people in a 1,000 square foot unit. I think 1 parking space just, in that case, wouldn't make it. I mean, that's why I'm saying that maybe just 1 space per unit may not work in all cases.
And if that was on the site plan for a detached accessory dwelling, that could also be the subject of the consideration of the special use permit.
Yeah, that's why I was asking about the language that would be in the ordinance.
It sounds like we've moved on from the Washington Park case. I want to make sure that we've gotten so Jerry can sit down. Okay, so are you all ready to move on to the next question on the list here? We already answered number 2, which was talking about how Airbnb and VRBO rentals would interface with this ordinance. The third question that Mr. Bryan proposed is how would trash, leaf, or recycling pickup be accommodated? And this would be accommodated through the same way. It would be standard curbside collection. The addition of a second unit wouldn't call for a commercial scale dumpster or anything like that. The city has a policy that if you have the ability to use 1 cart, that would be preferable, but they will also give you a second cart if you need it for a fee. So you could either have the principal structure and the accessory structure share 1 cart, or you could have 2 separate cards for each, and the same would apply for recycling. With regard to leaf pickup, it would still be the curbside leaf collection. You just take the leaves from your backyard and front yard and put them in the same pile out there.
I actually was referring to the brush carts, and I'm assuming you can just purchase as many of those as you want
Correct.
to.
Okay, the fourth question is how under existing zoning, i.e. all varieties covered under this proposal, homeowners can currently establish an accessory dwelling. And under the current ordinance, attached units can be approved by staff as long as those occupancy standards of the ordinance that we're having to move away from and use conditions are met. So it'll be the same as the current ordinance, since we're not enforcing the occupancy requirements. It'll still be all accessory units will have to meet the use conditions and get a staff permit. And all detached units in both the existing ordinance and the proposed ordinance would have to go through the Board of Adjustment process, special use permit review, with the 4 findings of fact being met all affirmatively and also meeting any of the use conditions. The fifth question is a briefing on how, under existing zoning, how current homeowners that are illegally having accessory units, in parenthesis, not occupied by relatives, might make their arrangements legal. So one thing that I wanted to point out is there are a few existing units in the community that are legally non-conforming, and those units, even under the current ordinance, you would be allowed to have unrelated people live in those units. And those are units that were established prior to 1968, and through the use of affidavits, you could prove that people unrelated to the principal unit were already residing on a rental basis in those prior to 1968. And in talking to inspections, that is a tool that's available at their disposal. Now, the other piece of that puzzle is if you wanted to legalize your unit, you would have to go through the Board of Adjustment special use process. And based on conferring with the city attorney's office, I guess for about a year or so, we've been not enforcing the relative or occupancy provisions of the ordinance. So today, someone could go to the Board of Adjustment, and if they meet the other conditions, the board could find affirmatively and grant them a special use permit for an accessory dwelling.
So, if someone wanted to bring a non-conforming into compliance, would they need to have an inspection of any kind, or?
I'm not sure whether or not they would require an actual zoning inspection for an existing building, but they would have to go through the regular permit process, which means they come into the permit office, submit a site plan that shows that they're meeting all of the setback requirements, and if necessary, which it usually is for an accessory dwelling, they would have to apply to the Board of Adjustment for a special use permit.
And then as part of that, we have the ability, if we see from our desktops through aerial photography that the dimensions or setbacks are not what they appear to be on the site plan, we can always have inspection staff go out in the field and see that.
Right, that's something that we can determine on a staff level, I guess, like Mr. Norby said, looking at aerial photographs, or the Board of Adjustment can place conditions on the issuance of a special use permit.
And just to, again, clarify, the use condition, the process would be the same under both the current ordinance and the proposed ordinance, in that there is a Board of Adjustment with the findings of fact and the public hearing. But the use conditions are much more stringent in the proposed draft ordinance than they are under the current ordinance with relation to setbacks and building size caps and where parking would be located, things of that nature.
Any other questions of Kirk?
Let me just ask a follow-up. That if someone, say, under the current ordinance had an accessory unit approved, and then this ordinance with the more stringent requirements gets approved, then they would be considered legally non-conforming?
Yes.
you, Kirk.
So what is the board's pleasure? Go forward with December hearing, or do you feel like there's some tweaks you want to make to it before it goes to public hearing, or?
I'm satisfied with it. I recognize that my level is hard, and that's fine, but I'm satisfied with it on the policy behind it. I think we gotta clean up what we have now. We know that from a case law standpoint. And, I'd rather us pass this. I think it's good policy, and, I'd rather have that than end up being in a situation where we've got an ordinance that we can't enforce, because of current case law. So I'd be in favor of letting it go forward. But I understand we've got some objections. I understand.
We can schedule the public hearing in December. There was no things that came up we wanted to change it. Nothing says we couldn't continue that a month and come back in January at this body again before we send it forward.
Correct.
So
I agree with that approach.
I would like to hear from other people's views as well in trying to sort out some of these other issues.
I kind of feel like there are a lot of unresolved issues that I would like to have a little more clarity on, or have a little more discussion, which I haven't brought up yet, between us. The main issues, I want to find out what Jerry has to say about that one family per lot possibility. The other thing is, I do have concerns about parking. I just don't think, I think that that may not be adequate in all cases, and I'd like to see what other options that we have for parking. Setbacks, I haven't brought this up before, but I do feel like there shouldn't be any encroachment into the existing setbacks, and that detached dwellings should really be treated as principal dwellings in terms of the setback. And the reason I feel that way is because if you can have a whole family living in a detached ADU, it seems to me like that's equivalent in impact to a whole house, in which case I think that the setback should be the same as for a principal dwelling. The other issue is that one that Mr. Bryan brought up about the single night rentals. I think that this is a very significant issue because it's a trend, and we don't know how it's going to play out, and we do have areas in the city that may have greater demand for single night rentals. And it seems to me that we should have a good idea of what our policy is going to be on single night rentals before we go ahead with this ordinance, or else just say no single night rentals in ADUs. I guess those were the main concerns that I had, and then just a few other things are, could we look into some kind of a complaint process to make sure that if there are issues with ADUs in neighborhoods, that we have a process for dealing with those. So I would just like to have further discussion of some of these, that we can nail them down and work something out that's
Ideally, for me, that would be another work session. I know we were reluctant on that, particularly during November. But I think we need to get some things clarified before it goes further in the public.
So, but wouldn't you think it'd be great to have other people's input on this, to take their questions to that work session also? I mean, it's like it's already been said, we could go ahead and have the hearing in December, take all those questions, and if it takes us February or whatever we need on this, because if we do this and then we get the questions asked after we clarified your two questions, then we're still in a dilemma of talking about those questions that may come up at the hearing.
This is a complex amendment, and from what I'm hearing from the work plan, we've got some catching up to do to bundle that other issue with this, and I think there's still some legal things that need to be figured out before the public. So I mean, I think we will probably, need some revisions after public comment, but I still think that there's enough already on the plate that it still needs to be tightened up or looking at some of the options. And in fact, the more interest I'm getting from staff, I'm wondering why we just don't drop the one requirement and go on, because people can already get it done now in a way, and it's a proper way. It's through the ZBA and everything like that. And the more interest I'm getting so far is that we really don't need to change, except for that piece that we haven't been enforcing and shouldn't be enforcing.
I think the problem is you don't have much of any restrictive standards in terms of how they can be placed. And so what's proposed is imposing more restrictive standards physically on it. They may not be the ultimate standards that you want to have, but it certainly is much more stringent than what is in the current ordinance.
Well, that was sort of my understanding of why it sort of went together, that if you change the occupancy requirements just by itself, then you may have more problems, so you're trying to narrow down the effect of just changing the occupancy to meet.
Right. We were recognizing the problem with expanding the universe of possibilities of applicants, so we wanted to restrict that to kind of help make it fit better and rule out those cases where it isn't fitting as better. And again, it's a judgment call as to what is the right combination of criteria.
Like I said, we could just change the family requirements and leave everything else like it is. I mean, you guys have made it a little bit more stringent. That's what you're trying to do. So, I mean, I've heard a lot of questions. I haven't heard a lot of recommended changes to what's proposed in the ordinance. So, I mean, I think staff needs a little more direction. If it's something that we don't like the language that's proposed, then we need to tell them what we do want.
Well, that's what I tried to do by saying one family per lot, and keep the setbacks the way they are, don't allow the 50% reduction. Parking, key it to the number of bedrooms. Those are specific proposals. And those are the kinds of things I like to have us debate about, whether, and then once, you know, I'm not assuming that my ideas are going to be agreed to by everyone. If people don't agree to them, then that's fine, but we should have the debate before we look at a document, an ordinance proposal. That's all I'm saying.
I guess the question is, do we debate all of those things along with debating the public input at the same time, or do we do it in stages?
Oh, does staff have thoughts on these issues, or?
I don't know that. I mean, I think some of these are certainly worth considering, but it'd be hard for me to write this second to kind of say, well, okay, we would propose this. As I could think of a couple other tweaks that would say that you have to have at least a minimum lot size before you can even qualify for asking for one. That might be another thing there. So I think, you know, if you want us to go back and kind of take consideration of these comments here and come back to you with what we would think some tweaks would be, and let you consider that might be a way to approach it.
And would you like to see those changes or suggestions emailed to you as an alternative and still try to do the public hearing, or do you want to push the public hearing back a month? We can. I mean, I know that the city wants to get this resolved, but
Jerry, do you know if there's how much is the urgency for having the public hearing in December and whatever that might entail after that?
There is some urgency. I don't think 1 month would make a huge difference, so there wouldn't be an issue if it needed to be tabled and discussed further.
I think we need to be careful about the holiday season and pulling something of this magnitude on as well. That you know, you want to be as open and get as much input in the process as we possibly can in terms of how it's going to impact things.
Is there any way to extend the public comment period to put it out there for longer? Or is
We-
it automatically just from 1 month?
We could, or, I mean, we're not locked in yet for it being a December public hearing, so we can move that back, or,
What's your thinking, Brenda? Moved it to January?
I don't know if there's a lot of questions, but I think we have to start somewhere and put it out there.
Yeah.
And with the discussions that we're having, they're all valid points and things to consider. But I don't know if us not agreeing or agreeing is really gonna solve the issue of what does the public think and their opportunity to comment. I don't wanna shortchange their ability to comment because we do too much tweaking ahead, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and have a public hearing, get the input from the neighbors. And then, because the folks that are likely to come to that are not gonna be tiny house advocates, I guess, or the developers. It's gonna be those neighbors in the neighborhoods that are most likely to be eligible for these accessory dwellings, right?
So if we do that, we're going to present what we've got? I mean, that's what's going to be presented.
I mean, we
Anything they want to present, but.
we
to
could
get
take
the
over the next few
public
days
input.
another look at some of, at your comments and see if we would propose any additional tweaks to it, and maybe close that out in the next week or so that everybody, then you all and anyone in the public has a chance to see what is the proposed ordinance and have a public hearing on that.
Is there any requirement to make a decision after a certain number of days from the public hearing? I mean, continuances? Yeah.
We can continue it here 2 months.
2 months.
Right.
That would give us, okay.
January and February,
Right.
if need be.
Give us a chance to, with public input and everyone's ideas and staff's changes, that would be the maximum amount of information we're probably gonna get from the decision.
Yeah, I would like to see those tweaks that you were talking about, and I forgot to mention one important tweak that I would suggest, and that's the definition of attached dwelling. And so that a truly detached unit shouldn't count as attached.
And this is where we have our discussions among ourselves, because I don't necessarily agree with those tweaks.
Yeah.
So do we take,
So if we look at a menu of tweaks, at least we have some ideas about what the possibilities are.
Okay.
Well, so we're going to basically present an ordinance we may not agree with.
Well, and I don't
Hey, we want
this
all of it.
meeting next month to turn into another work session. I mean, I understand the sense of urgency, but maybe we end up at a January work session doing this. I don't sit here and debate this for 2 or 3
Well,
hours.
that's the thing, that's why I don't,
If-
but better not to do it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm certainly open to that. If you all want to just continue this to an actual work session, a real work session that we devote to this.
But I'm sensitive to the city wanting to get this done.
Right.
So,
I don't think there'll be a problem with the continuance if you need to have a work session. Like I
Then-
said, it's
yeah,
urgent,
but if we do that, that means a February public hearing, January
I
work
think we can
session will
live
be
with
the
that.
4th week,
If need be, we can, we
and
can.
public
work
hearing
on
in
So-
February.
It'll probably get continued, one more time. Probably March or April
All right.
before you get a decision. or-
So am I hearing that everyone can live with the idea of putting this off till the January work session? Let us work on these tweaks. We'll bring you a retweaked ordinance. You can talk about that draft in January, and then at that point, decide to go forward with a public hearing in February. Is that-
I'm fine with that, if the city's okay with it. Okay, all right, if Lee gets upset, I'm gonna tell him you said it was okay.
That's fine.
All right. Okay. Okay.
I think in this case, it's probably Angela, the city attorney, who's worried about this.
Okay, all right. We could save this hour and wait till January then, I guess. But anyway,
Yeah, what did you
okay.
suggest
All right, Paul, if you got anything else in the staff report,
That is it.
I don't want to ask, but okay.
I promise.
All right.
I promise.
Okay. Anything for the good of the order?
I'd just like to thank all our veterans. I know yesterday was Veterans Day. I just want to take the opportunity to thank them for their service and and you know, everything that they do for this country. And also to wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving and have a happy and blessed one. And with all that being said, motion to adjourn.
Second? Second, all in favor? Aye. Adjourn, okay.